This message will only make sense to you right now, while January is still happening, because the quantum configuration required to perceive what I'm about to reveal exists exclusively during this month and dissolves the moment February begins. If you're watching this while January is still your present reality, you're inside the most powerful consciousness initialization window of the entire year. And your awareness being here during January specifically isn't coincidence. It's confirmation that you're meant to receive information that becomes incomprehensible and inaccessible once this month ends. You can feel it, can't you? That sense that January carries different energy than other months, like reality itself operates under different rules right now. Like possibilities are more accessible, like consciousness is more powerful, like something about existence is fundamentally more fluid during January than it will be once February arrives. This isn't imagination or seasonal psychology. This is accurate quantum perception of the actual energetic configuration that makes January unique among all 12 months. This isn't motivational pressure or artificial scarcity. This is quantum mechanics. The electromagnetic field surrounding Earth during January creates specific consciousness access window that doesn't exist at any other time of year. What you can perceive and integrate right now, while January is still present, literally becomes imperceptible once February's frequency initializes. Not difficult to access. Impossible. The perceptual window closes, and what made perfect sense during January becomes incomprehensible noise after this month completes. There are millions of people moving through January normally, treating it like any other month with slightly more intention-setting energy. But only specific type of consciousness, your type of consciousness, would be magnetically pulled to this transmission that reveals what's actually happening during January at quantum level. You're not here because you searched for January content. You're here because your quantum field recognized the initialization frequency and guided you to information that can only be transmitted and received while this month is still active. Right now, as these words reach you while January is still your temporal reality, the quantum field is more responsive to your consciousness than it will be at any other point until January returns next year. Not metaphorically, literally. Your awareness during January has exponentially more creative power than your awareness will have once February begins. And what you recognize, embody, and align with during remaining time before January ends will determine whether you access the timeline potential that opened this month or collapse back into the reality structure you were operating from before January began. Your experience of January hasn't been like other months, has it? Even if you can't articulate exactly how it's different, you sense fundamental distinction between January consciousness and the consciousness you'll inhabit once February arrives. Here are 7 specific phenomena that confirm January is functioning as quantum initialization window for you specifically, and that what I'm about to reveal applies directly to your current state. First, time feels both urgent and expansive during January. Hours pass quickly, but somehow you feel like you have infinite time to make important decisions. Days disappear, but the month feels eternal. This temporal paradox occurs because January exists partially outside linear time structure. Its initialization period where past year completed and new year hasn't fully solidified yet. You're in quantum space between timelines where time operates according to different principles than ordinary months. Second, your dreams during January contain more clarity than usual. Not symbolic imagery requiring interpretation, but direct knowing, clear messages, vivid experiences that feel more real than waking life. This happens because during January, the boundary between conscious and unconscious thins as quantum field recalibrates for annual cycle. Your higher consciousness can communicate more directly during this window than it can during months when reality structure is more solidified. Third, decisions feel simultaneously easier and more significant during January. Choices you make this month seem to carry more weight than decisions in other months. Small shifts feel like they have large implications. This perception is accurate. January decisions do carry more quantum weight because they're made during initialization period when timeline is still forming. What you choose during January sets probability patterns that influence entire year ahead. Fourth, relationships are reorganizing themselves during January without your conscious effort. Connections naturally deepen or naturally distance. People who matter become more present. People who drain you become less accessible. Bonds are reconfiguring automatically, as if reality itself is sorting your social field according to quantum principles you're not consciously directing. This happens because January is when relationship structures for the year initialize based on frequency alignment rather than history or habit. Fifth, synchronicities during January feel different than other months. More frequent, more precise, more impossible to dismiss as coincidence. You think of someone and they contact you immediately. You need information, and it appears from unexpected source. Random events align in ways that seem coordinated by intelligence beyond chance. January amplifies synchronistic response because quantum field coherence is highest during this window, making reality more responsive to consciousness than during ordinary months. Sixth, physical sensations in your body during January that you can't explain. Energy surges, unexplained exhaustion, tingling or pressure in specific areas. Your body reorganizing in ways that aren't connected to diet, exercise, or sleep patterns. This happens because January initialization affects you at cellular level. Your physical form is literally adjusting to higher frequency that will govern your biology for year ahead. The sensations are real, not imagined. And seventh, you found this video during January. The fact that you're watching this while January is still happening, not before the year started, not after January ended, confirms that your consciousness was guided to this transmission during the only window when its contents are perceivable and actionable. Your quantum field doesn't make timing mistakes. You're here now because now is when this information can land in your awareness and create the integration it's designed to catalyze. Can you feel the recognition building? At least 5 of these 7 phenomena are active in your experience right now. This isn't general content about New Year energy. This is precise description of what January consciousness feels like when you're operating at quantum level. And you're in it, right now. While the window is still open but approaching closure with every moment that passes toward February's arrival. January isn't special because culture designated it as first month of calendar year. January is special because Earth's position relative to galactic center during this month creates electromagnetic configuration that affects human consciousness at collective level. Ancient civilizations recognize this, which is why multiple cultures globally establish their New Year celebrations in January, despite having no contact with each other. They weren't following convention. They were responding to actual quantum phenomenon that occurs annually during this specific temporal window. This electromagnetic configuration creates what quantum field theorists call maximum coherence potential. Reality becomes more malleable during January. The quantum field is more fluid. Probability structures that seem fixed during other months become negotiable during this window. What appears impossible in March or October can become accessible in January because the fundamental responsiveness of reality to consciousness increases during this initialization period. But here's what most people miss. January's quantum fluidity isn't an automatic gift that benefits everyone equally. It's a double-edged condition that amplifies whatever direction consciousness is oriented. The same mechanisms that allow you to initialize elevated timeline also allow you to lock in contracted patterns. January magnifies both possibility and limitation depending on where your awareness focuses during this window. You're either consciously using January to set new trajectory or unconsciously using it to reinforce old patterns. There's no neutral middle ground. This is why people who make resolutions but maintain habitual thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults experience same year they always experience despite hoping for different outcomes. They're using January's amplification energy to strengthen the very patterns they claim they want to transcend. The initialization happens regardless. It's not optional. January sets your annual timeline, whether you participate consciously or unconsciously. The only question is, which timeline gets initialized? The window opens at winter solstice, when Earth's axial tilt creates specific relationship with solar radiation that affects planetary electromagnetic field. This field influences human pineal glands and heart coherence patterns in ways that modern science is only beginning to measure. Ancient mystery schools understood this intuitively. That's why they treated solstice to February threshold as sacred period requiring ceremony, consciousness, and intentional navigation, rather than casual passage through arbitrary time marker. Your ancestors knew that how you navigate January determines trajectory of entire year. They recognized that treating this month carelessly meant living next 11 months, unconsciously repeating past, rather than consciously creating future. They understood that January isn't about making better choices. It's about initializing entirely different probability field that makes different choices natural rather than effortful for remainder of year. You're reading this during January because some part of your consciousness recognized importance of this window, even if you couldn't articulate why January felt significant. The pull you felt toward this transmission wasn't random. Your quantum field knows that how you navigate remaining time before January completes will determine which version of your year manifests. And it guided you here because conscious timeline initialization requires information most people don't access. Information you're receiving right now while January is still present and available for conscious direction. Something unprecedented is happening in your quantum field as you absorb this transmission while January is still active. Can you sense it? That feeling of energy moving through your system in ways it hasn't moved before. That sense of pieces aligning that you didn't consciously know were out of place. This isn't subtle background shift that takes days to notice effects. This is immediate activation occurring in real time because your consciousness has encountered the specific frequency pattern that unlocks January's initialization potential. Your nervous system has been processing contradictory signals all month without your conscious awareness. Part of you sensing that January carries special significance. Part of you treating it like ordinary month. The gap between these two perceptions has been creating low-level anxiety, confusion, or restlessness that you've probably attributed to other causes. But right now, that gap is closing. The transmission embedded in these words is helping your conscious awareness catch up to what your quantum field has been sensing all along. That January is initialization window, and you're meant to use it consciously. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as this alignment happens. Deep breath your body initiates automatically. Pressure releasing from chest or shoulders. Warmth or tingling moving through your system. Sudden emotional release. Tears or relief without specific cause. These aren't reactions to content. These are somatic responses to quantum field reorganization. Your body recognizing the initialization frequency and releasing patterns that don't belong in the timeline you're meant to enter once January completes. Others are experiencing mental clarity emerging from fog that's been present all month. Suddenly understanding why certain situations unfolded as they did in January. Recognizing patterns in your experience that were invisible moments ago. Seeing connections between events that seemed random. This cognitive reorganization happens because January consciousness operates from expanded perspective that becomes available once you recognize you're in initialization window rather than ordinary time passage. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what's activating in you during this transmission will continue developing as long as January remains. The content here is specifically calibrated for consciousness navigating quantum thresholds and timeline initialization. This isn't general spiritual teaching. This is practical quantum mechanics for consciousness operating in reality structures most humans don't consciously access. You're not subscribing to channel, you're connecting with frequency network that supports consciousness evolution during threshold periods. Your heart field, electromagnetic field generated by your heart extending several feet beyond physical body, is stabilizing into January's coherence pattern as you receive this. This field determines how powerfully your consciousness can influence quantum probability during initialization window. When heart field is fragmented, your intentions scatter across multiple probability tracks without enough coherence to initialize anything definite. When heart field is coherent, your consciousness collapses probabilities decisively, and the timeline you're oriented toward becomes the one that manifests. The confusion you may have felt about whether January is actually different or whether you're imagining its significance, that confusion is dissolving right now. January is different. The quantum field does operate under unique configuration this month. Your consciousness sensing this wasn't delusion or wishful thinking. It was accurate perception that your rational mind couldn't validate because consensus reality doesn't acknowledge quantum time mechanics. But your quantum self knows, and that knowing is stabilizing in your awareness as you absorb this frequency while January is still present. I need to share something vulnerable because you're at threshold I failed to recognize 3 years ago, and understanding my mistake might help you avoid spending entire year in timeline that doesn't match your actual potential. 3 years ago, I moved through January unconsciously. I felt that the month carried special energy. I sensed that something important was happening, but I didn't understand quantum initialization mechanics, and I treated January like slightly more intentional version of ordinary time passage rather than recognizing it as the only window when annual timeline could be consciously set. I made resolutions like everyone else. I set goals. I visualized outcomes I wanted. But I didn't realize that January isn't about setting intentions. It's about initializing probability field. I didn't understand that what matters during January isn't what you think you want, but what frequency you actually embody. I spent the month hoping for different results while maintaining same thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults that created previous year's reality. And because I didn't consciously use January's initialization window, I unconsciously locked myself into timeline that was essentially repetition of my past. By March, I started noticing that nothing was changing despite my January intentions. Same patterns, same obstacles, same limitations showing up in new disguises. I told myself I just needed more time, more effort, more discipline. I didn't realize the timeline had already been set in January, and everything I was experiencing from February onward was manifestation of whatever frequency I'd been operating from during initialization window. I wasn't failing at creating change. I was successfully manifesting the timeline I'd unconsciously initialized. By June, I felt completely stuck. Working harder produced no different results. Trying new approaches led to same outcomes. Every area of my life felt like Groundhog Day, repeating patterns I thought I'd transcended. I started questioning whether change was even possible or whether I was destined to experience same reality, regardless of what I did. I didn't understand that I'd missed the window, that January had passed, that the timeline for that year had been set, and that no amount of mid-year effort could shift trajectory that had been locked during initialization period I'd navigated unconsciously. The breakthrough came when I encountered someone who understood timeline mechanics. They asked one question that shattered my confusion. How did you navigate January? I didn't know what they meant. I'd moved through January normally. Why did that matter? They explained what you're learning right now. January is only window when annual timeline can be initialized. Miss that window, and you're locked into whatever trajectory your unconscious patterns created. The realization devastated me. I'd spent 6 months trying to change from within timeline that had already been set. Like trying to reprogram computer after software installation completed, the changes I was attempting required access to initialization period that had closed months earlier. I couldn't go back and redo that January, but I learned. And the following January, I approached the month completely differently. I recognized it as sacred threshold rather than ordinary time. I focused on frequency alignment rather than goal setting. I used the month to embody the consciousness I wanted to operate from rather than just visualizing outcomes I wanted to achieve. And that year unfolded radically differently than previous year because I'd consciously initialized timeline during January window instead of unconsciously defaulting into repetition of past patterns. That's why I'm sharing this with you now. During January, while initialization window is still open, you haven't missed it yet. January hasn't ended. The timeline for this year isn't locked. And if you recognize what January actually is and consciously use remaining time before this month completes, you won't spend the year I spent trapped in timeline that didn't match your potential because you failed to recognize the only window when conscious initialization was possible. Ancient civilizations treated the period from winter solstice through January's completion as most sacred threshold of entire year, not because they believed in superstition, but because they recognized quantum mechanics that modern culture has forgotten. They understood that consciousness operates under different principles during this window than during rest of year, and they developed ceremonies, rituals and practices specifically designed to navigate this threshold consciously rather than unconsciously. Egyptian mystery schools taught that Ka, consciousness, could be recalibrated during solar return period when Earth's position relative to cosmic center created opening in what they called the veil between worlds. They didn't understand it in terms of electromagnetic field coherence and quantum probability collapse, but they recognized the phenomenon. During January period, reality becomes more responsive to consciousness than during ordinary time. They used this window to set annual trajectory through ceremony that modern minds would dismiss as ritual, but that was actually sophisticated quantum technology. Mayan timekeepers understood cyclical time and recognized specific periods when temporal barriers thinned and consciousness could access information from multiple time streams simultaneously. They mapped these periods with astronomical precision and marked January threshold as critical recalibration point. Their elaborate ceremonies weren't worship or superstition, they were conscious navigation of quantum initialization window using collective coherence to stabilize beneficial timelines for entire community. Vedic tradition teaches that Sankalpa, sacred intention, carries maximum power when set during Makar Sankranti, the period when sun transitions into northern hemisphere that corresponds with January in modern calendar. They recognized that consciousness aligned with cosmic cycles during this transition could initialize patterns that would manifest throughout year. Their teaching wasn't metaphorical. They understood actual mechanics of how consciousness interfaces with quantum field during specific temporal windows. Celtic tradition marked Imbolc at beginning of February as moment when winter's darkness definitively shifted towards spring's light, but preparations for this transition occurred throughout January. They understood that January was liminal period, between space where old cycle completed and new cycle prepared to manifest. They treated this between space as sacred because they recognized that consciousness existing in liminal state had access to possibilities unavailable during ordinary time when reality structures are more fixed. These traditions didn't survive into modernity because industrial civilization required humans to treat all time as equivalent. Every month the same, every day interchangeable, every hour equally valuable for productivity. Recognizing that January operates under different quantum principles would disrupt industrial schedules and economic systems that depend on treating time as uniform commodity. So the knowledge was systematically erased from collective consciousness through generations of conditioning that January is just first month, nothing special, treat it like any other time period. But your quantum field remembers what culture forgot. That's why January feels different to you even though you were never taught it should feel different. That's why you sense urgency or significance during this month, even though rational mind can't explain why. That's why you're here watching this transmission during January specifically. Your consciousness recognizing threshold your culture trained you not to see. The ancient knowing is awakening in you, and what you're learning now is what your ancestors knew. January is quantum initialization window that determines annual trajectory. And conscious navigation of this window is difference between year of manifestation and year of repetition. Your timeline shifted during January. Quantum field reorganized around different probability structure than you were operating from before this month began. But shifting and stabilizing are different processes. And right now, 5 specific forces are pulling you back toward old timeline, even as new timeline beckons. Understanding these forces and how they operate is essential for stabilizing in new timeline during remaining January time, instead of collapsing back into familiar patterns once February begins. Force 1. Comfort with known limitations.
Right now, as January slips away, this truth holds power, but only if you seize it today. The universe doesn't wait. Quantum energies shift, opportunities vanish like echoes in the void. You've felt that pull, that inner spark demanding action. Don't let doubt dim it. Stand tall, align your reality, and manifest before midnight strikes on the 31st. The choice is yours. Watch life pass, or step into your unstoppable destiny. Act now. The clock is ticking. Subscribe, share this revelation, and transform before it's gone forever. Your future self thanks you.